Well, hello everyone. I'm Rozeboom, the IPM Coordinator, and I work within the Dr. Verhorst Entomology Lab. So a lot of the stuff that we do out here, or all the stuff we do out here, relates to IPM in general, but insects specifically. So out here at the Southeast Research Farm, all of our research for the most part, at least our large field plots, coincide with the Soybean Gall Midge. A little background on that guy. We first discovered them in 2015 here in South Dakota, and since then we've been scouting them every year, going out, multiple different counties across South Dakota. And as of this past year, we've confirmed Soybean Gall Midge in 26 different counties in South Dakota. Out of those 26 counties, it seems like our southeast corners or counties in South Dakota, so this area around here, is where you get your major infestations, where you get yield loss in your field. Some of the stuff we learned since 2015, since the gall midge have showed up, they overwinter in the soil as a larva in a silken cocoon. And then in early spring, usually around June, around this time, is when we see those adults emerge out of the soil, and they lay eggs, on your at the base of your soybean plant. And then throughout that summer, those larvae live inside that soybean stem, fall back into the soil, emerge as a second generation adult to reinfest more soybean plants, or at least that's the working theory. With that, where those adults emerge in early spring, this is the reason why we have these emergence traps. Basically, the whole premise of it is we put them into a field, hoping that we get lucky enough to where an adult will emerge in spring, follow the mesh up towards our jar at the top here. Here's a demonstration of that. We just have a silicone funnel that directs them into that jar, and those gall midges are, I guess, not clever enough to get back out. Every week or so we come out, we collect the jars, we bring them back to the lab, and we see if we can find any adults within that field. So this is a network of emergence traps. There's 12 of them here at Southeast Research Farm, but we also have some at the Volga Research Farm and the Northeast Research Farm, and we'll just keep monitoring them throughout the year. Now, I mentioned that there is a second generation of adults. That actually is just a hypothesis. We're not entirely sure if that is true. So throughout the year, these cages, once the soybeans get taller, we'll move them a couple feet further away, just to see if we keep getting more adults. If we only get adults in these traps in early spring around this time, then we know that there's only one generation of adults. The other hypothesis on the life cycle of the gall midge is that the larvae actually reproduce asexually, so they skip the adult stage entirely. Again, we haven't verified that at all. Since the gall midge is so new, there's a lot of unknowns, and that's why we do a lot of these field trials and these emergent traps to try to figure that out. In 2019, there was two experts in the entire world on midges in general. One of them came out of retirement to look at the gall midge, and it is a brand new species to science, and that was confirmed in 2019. So with that, comes a lot of those questions that we're trying to answer in our field trials. So with these emergence cages, this is, kind of how we figure out that generation, whether they're asexual reproduction with the larva or if it's the second generation adults. That's what this study covers. Some of our other studies that we have two different field trials off to my right here. The field trial closest to me here, that study, what we're looking at is seed treatments and foliar insecticide applications, see if there is an effect on those soybean gall midge. So far, research has shown that foliar insecticides do not work. A different variety of soybeans, it doesn't matter, it attacks any variety of soybean. Tillage doesn't work, and we're just trying to tease that out. So this study has multiple different seed treatments, multiple different foliar insecticides, different kinds, because we can't rule out that one of those active ingredients won't have, an effect on the soybean gall midge. And with this study, we found, at least in other studies, that at the V2 growth stage of soybean, when those adults are emerging around June or so, that you can reduce your soybean gall midge populations by hitting those adults at the perfect time. Though that's very tricky because we're not entirely sure when they emerge. Last year, June 13th, is when we caught our first soybean gall midge in our emergence cages. That was further south of here. This year, just June 17th, we got our first 2 adult gall midges in our emergence cages, one near Burbank, South Dakota, and Mechling, South Dakota. So it seems like, for the most part, they do emerge sometime in mid-June, and that might be, with our spray trial here, we might be able to figure that out. If spraying around that time does help you reduce your soybean gall midge populations. Now, the last study we have off to the right here, it's looking at a couple hundred different soybean varieties. So as I mentioned earlier, your soybean varieties, what we found, it doesn't matter what variety you have, but with this study we're looking at several hundred different lines or variations of soybean, and we're basically just throwing the kitchen sink at it, throwing all the genetics that we have on hand, just to see if something has tolerance or resistance to that soybean gall midge. So with that study, we'll be looking at it throughout the year. Some basic information on your soybean gall midge. Those adults, they're about 1/4 of an inch from leg tip to leg tip. They have white and black bands on their legs, and that's a dead giveaway if you have a soybean gall midge. They kind of look like a tiny mosquito for the most part. And they do have a bright orange abdomen. The larva, you might be able to find some in earlier soybean like this, but we do think that you won't see a heavy infestation until around V6 R1 soybean. Reason being because the stems of the soybeans aren't large enough to facilitate larval growth. So if you do see a larva in soybean about this, I think this is V4, it'll be quite small. There's 3 different instars of larvae. Your first instars that you would see now are very tiny and they're white, so they're very hard to see. Your second instar, they get a little bigger. They're kind of pinkish to orangish, a little bigger size. And then your third instar are the ones you'll most likely see in your later growth soybean. Those are bright orange in color and very evident if you have them. Later this year, we highly recommend to start scouting around that V6 R1 growth stage of soybean. Some of the key things to remember is that soybean gall midge will always start at the very edge of your field. And what you want to look for are soybean plants that are wilted or discolored. If you don't see that, you can walk through your soybean rows, check at the very base of your soybean plant, and if you see any discoloration or a bulbous kind of gall at the base, you want to crack that open and peel your epidermis back. And if you have those bright orange larvae, that is definitely your gall midge. So that's a surefire way to know if you have that or not. Management wise, if you have gall midge in your field but your field looks fine, there's really nothing much you can do. If you do have a heavy infestation the year before, like I said, you could possibly apply foliar insecticide at R2 to cut back. But the other thing we found that really helps with your gall midge is a late planting date for your soybean. Reason being, kind of like how I mentioned before, your stems won't be as thick when you have the heavy infestation, so your soybean basically won't facilitate the growth of that gall midge. One other key factor for the gall midge is they overwinter in the soil always from the previous crop. Some other alternative hosts that we've discovered that some soybean gall midge grows in or lives in is alfalfa and sweet clover. So if you have either of those next to your soybean crop this year, definitely keep a close eye on that soybean crop, because that's where the infestations most likely will happen. All right, as I mentioned earlier with the soybean gall midge that I discussed earlier, with those emergence cages, we're monitoring every week to see when those adult gall midges emerge. Along with that, we look at all these other different insects across South Dakota, mostly eastern South Dakota. And as you see here, we have some traps that we put out, and we check these every week. These are specialized traps, sticky traps they're called. They have a lure inside them that releases a pheromone, and that attracts the species that you want to collect every week. The 3 here, we have black cutworm, Bertha armyworm, and true armyworm. As of right now, we have not had either of those insects show up. And then off to my far left here is our black light trap. That's a more generalized type trap that we come out and check 2 times a week. And with that one, we can collect multiple different types of moths and beetles. And all 3 of these, just like the Gall Midge traps, they're just there so we can kind of know, when something shows up. When something does show up and we positively, ID it, confirm what it is, we'll put up an article on our newsletter, the Pest and Crop newsletter that comes out every week on Monday mornings. So, thank you.